The battle had been going badly for 3 hours. Commander Voss stood at the center of the TES Verdun's bridge and watched the tactical screen fill with red. Every red dot was a Terran ship dying. She had stopped counting after the 6th one went dark. Hull breach on Deck 4, Ensign Dak Prell called from the damage control station. He had a protein bar in his hand. He always had a protein bar in his hand. Containment holding. Barely. Barely is fine, Voss said. Outside, the Quorum advance fleet moved like something with too many arms and too much patience. 400 ships. Clean. Coordinated. The kind of enemy that did not get excited, did not make mistakes. They added up numbers and acted on the sum. Right now, the sum was very bad for humanity. The Battle of Threshold Gate had started as a defense operation. 40 Terran and Allied ships holding the gate against the Quorum's advance fleet. It had stayed a real fight for about 90 minutes. Then it became something else. A rout. Ships peeling away from the line one by one as the Quorum punched through their formation. Clean, fast, inevitable. Nav Chief Solace was humming. She hummed when she was running calculations. Soft and tuneless and constant. Voss had learned to listen for it. When Solace stopped humming, the news was always bad. Right now she was humming. That was something. Lieutenant Okafor had a small photograph taped to the edge of his console. His daughter. Voss knew this the way she knew most things about her crew. Not because anyone told her, but because she had been watching these people for 6 months, and attention was its own kind of knowing. He had not looked at the photo once since the battle started. Prell looked up. Admiral Cho on the fleet channel. Voss did not move. Put it through. The voice of someone who had already made the decision and was now in the part where they executed it. All Terran vessels, disengage. Threshold Gate is lost. Fall back to secondary position. This is not a request. Repeat, all Terran vessels disengage. The acknowledgements came in fast. Call signs dropping off the tactical screen one by one as ships turned away. TES Callaway, TES Marshpoint, TES Orenbridge. Each one going quiet, like a light switched off in a room that had too many lights to begin with. The Verdun did not respond. Voss watched the screen. She watched the Allied ships pull away in clean arcs that looked almost graceful from far enough back. She watched the Quorum fleet begin to reorient toward the gate. She knew what came after a gate fell. Everyone knew. 3 planets sat behind Threshold Gate. Populated ones. The kind with food halls and bad noodles, and children running between tables while their parents ignored them. She had been to Kepler Station once, a supply run 3 years before the war. She had eaten the worst noodles of her life in the station food hall, and argued with the dockmaster about cargo limits, and she had thought when she left that it was a good place. The kind of place worth bad noodles. Kepler Station was gone. She had received the retreat order that day too. She had followed it. The station died anyway. 14,000 people, and the retreat had saved nothing she could point to. Nothing she could hold. She was done with retreat orders. Nav, she said. Solace looked up from her console. Bring us about. Point us at the gate. The humming stopped. The bridge went still, not for long. 4 seconds, maybe 5. Then Solace turned back to her console and began to work. Nobody argued. That was the thing about this crew. Half of them were survey techs who had retrained on weapons when the war reached their sector. They were not military people the way academies produced military people. They were practical people. People who had arrived at this through necessity and the particular stubbornness of those who had no other options left. They understood a decision when they heard one. Okafor's hands moved to his console. He did not look at the photo. Prell finished his protein bar, folded the wrapper, went back to the damage board. The Verdun came around. It was a mid-class survey escort vessel, not a warship, built to escort research missions and move equipment between stations. Its hull was thicker than average, because survey ships sometimes went through debris fields. Its weapons were fine, not impressive. It was, by any military measurement, absolutely the wrong ship to be sitting in when you decided to hold a position against 400 enemy vessels. It was the only ship Voss had. On the Quorum fleet's tactical display, a single Terran vessel sat motionless in the center of an empty engagement zone. Every other Terran and Allied signature was withdrawing. This one was not moving. It was, in fact, turning toward the fleet. In the Quorum fleet's command node, a networked collective intelligence that called itself Seventh Convergence, 90,000 data streams processed this simultaneously. The new scan confirmed the lone vessel was a mid-class escort cruiser with hull damage and reduced power output. Seventh Convergence ran its threat assessment. Minimal threat. Continue advance. But the vessel was not moving. Seventh Convergence ran the assessment again. Same result. It ran a behavioral model next, a comprehensive model built across 4 centuries and dozens of conquered species. The model said clearly, when a single damaged vessel faces overwhelming force and all its allies have withdrawn, the vessel retreats or surrenders. These were the only 2 options the model contained for this situation. They were the only 2 options any species had ever chosen in this situation. The vessel was doing neither. Seventh Convergence noted the anomaly and filed it for post-engagement review. There were enough data points in the universe, the hive mind reasoned, that a single outlier could occasionally be encountered without full explanation. Equipment malfunction, damaged navigation, communication failure, something mundane. It advanced toward the gate. The Verdun fired. The shot hit the lead Quorum escort vessel at a precise point in its forward hull, a point that would have required detailed knowledge of Quorum ship construction to find. Voss had spent 6 months reading every recovered Quorum wreckage report she could get her hands on. She had read them instead of sleeping. She had read them instead of a lot of things. The escort vessel's forward section went dark. Seventh Convergence paused. This was not something it did often. On the Verdun's bridge, Prel opened a fresh protein bar. Solus had started humming again. Okafor worked with the steady focus of a person who has made a choice and is now living inside it. Voss stood at the center of her bridge and watched 400 Quorum ships orient toward her. All of them, together, the way a tide turns. She said, "Let's make this take a while." The Verdun moved toward them. Behind it, the last Allied ship cleared the engagement zone. There were no other Terran vessels left. No Allied signatures within scanner range. Just the Verdun, and the gate, and the 400 ships between them. Solus hummed, Prel chewed, Okafor worked. Voss watched the screen. She had no plan that made sense. She had a ship, a crew, and a decision she had already made. She had done the thing past the point of undoing, and now there was only the part that came next. One breath, then one after that. The Quorum fleet opened fire. 12 hours in, the Verdun was still there. This was the part that Seventh Convergence kept returning to. It had run the probability of the Verdun surviving the first hour of engagement, and the number had been small. Not 0, but small enough that the hive mind had mentally closed the file and moved forward with its advance toward the gate. Then the first hour passed. The Verdun was still there. Seventh Convergence ran the second hour probability, smaller than the first. The vessel had taken significant hull damage. Its power output had dropped. By every measurement Seventh Convergence could take, this ship should have been debris. The second hour passed. The Verdun was still there. By the fourth hour, the probability numbers had become the kind of numbers that Seventh Convergence's models had never actually needed to calculate before. Numbers that existed in theory, the way very large distances exist in theory. Numbers you know are real, but have never had to use. The hive mind had 90,000 data streams. It turned several thousand of them toward this one mid-class Terran survey vessel, and it watched. What it saw did not help. The Verdun was using the debris field, the wreckage of the earlier battle, destroyed ships from both sides, had created a wide band of drifting metal and dead hull sections between the fleet and the gate. Most vessels avoided debris fields during combat. The lines of fire were complicated, and the navigation risk was high. The Verdun lived in the debris field. It moved through it the way something small and fast moves through places too cluttered for something large and organized. Every time the Corum fleet established a clean firing solution, the Verdun shifted. It used the wrecks. It used the electromagnetic interference from the gate. It used angles that made Seventh Convergence's tactical models produce results flagged as impractical, because no rational combatant chose approaches that dangerous. The Verdun did not appear to be consulting the impracticality ratings. At hour 6, the Verdun destroyed a Corum heavy frigate. The frigate had 3 times the Verdun's firepower, and twice its hull mass. Seventh Convergence reviewed the engagement recording 17 times. The Verdun had come out of the debris field at an angle, fired at a specific point on the frigate's underside, and then gone back into the debris field before the frigate's supporting vessels could respond. The point it had fired on was a known structural weakness in that frigate class, a weakness that was in no Terran intelligence database that Seventh Convergence was aware of. The hive mind noted this in its files. It noted everything. It was very good at noting things. It was becoming, for the first time in 4 centuries, unsure what to do with its notes. On the Verdun's bridge, the situation was simpler. Simpler did not mean better. Deck 7 had a hull breach that the repair crew had sealed with emergency foam and a piece of storage panel from the cargo bay. The forward sensor array was running at 60%. The ship's coffee maker had been hit by a power surge in hour 3 and was producing something that smelled like coffee and tasted like a threat. Prell was on his 9th protein bar. He had started keeping count. Solus was still humming. The tune had changed. It was slower now, something she had learned as a child on a small station in a system Voss had never visited. Solus had mentioned it once, briefly, and had not mentioned it since. Voss had not asked. Okafor ran weapons with the quiet focus of a person who had found the exact version of himself that the moment required. He did not look at the photo. He did not need to. It was there. That was enough. Voss ate half a food ration standing at the command console. She did not sit. She had not sat in 12 hours. Her back hurt in a way she was no longer registering as information. "They're trying to go around us again," Solus said. "I see it." Voss watched the Corum fleet shift on the tactical screen. Every few hours they would attempt to move past the Verdun toward the gate, and every time they did, the Verdun repositioned to force re-engagement. It could not stop them permanently. It was one ship, but it could make the cost of ignoring it greater than the cost of dealing with it. And dealing with it, so far, had proven more expensive than Seventh Convergence had planned for. "Naz, put us on an intercept line for the left flank push." Solus adjusted course, still humming. It was at hour 12 that Seventh Convergence made the decision that it would later classify as unprecedented in its operational history. It opened a communication channel. Specifically, it opened a direct channel to the Verdun. The Corum advance had never done this during an active engagement. There was no protocol for it. Surrender demands were delivered after engagement, once the outcome was no longer in question. This was something else. Seventh Convergence was not offering surrender terms. It was offering safe passage. The message was direct and clear. The Verdun and its crew could leave, right now. Full withdrawal, no pursuit. The Corum fleet would allow the vessel to exit the engagement zone without further attack. The offer was unconditional. The bridge crew looked at Voss. Voss read the message, looked at the screen, looked at her crew, looked back at the screen. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. She opened the channel. "No thank you." She closed the channel. Prell stared at her. He had stopped chewing. "No thank you," he repeated very quietly, in the tone of someone confirming they had heard correctly. "We're busy," Voss said. Prell looked at his protein bar. He looked at the tactical screen showing 400 Corum vessels. He looked back at his protein bar. He opened his mouth, and then closed it again, and went back to the damage board. Inside 7th Convergence, 90,000 data streams processed the response simultaneously. The behavioral model updated, then updated again, then produced a result that had a flag attached that 7th Convergence had never seen in 4 centuries of operation. The flag was not a tactical designation. It was something the hive mind's architecture reserved for data that did not fit any existing category. It translated roughly as unknown type. The Verdun had understood the offer. The communication had been clear, and its translation accurate. The vessel's crew knew they were going to be destroyed. They had been told they could leave. They had declined. 7th Convergence did not have a model for this. It had a model for sacrifice. Species produced individual martyrs when the cause was large enough. This was understood. But martyrdom had a shape. It had a logic. A martyr gave up their life for something greater, a people, a belief, a future. The algorithm could locate the cause and predict the behavior. There was no cause here that 7th Convergence could find. The gate was already functionally controlled. The Allied fleet had retreated. Holding this position would not save the planets behind the gate from eventual occupation. The Verdun stand was not changing the strategic outcome. It was simply refusing to accept the strategic outcome. The hive mind filed this under unknown type and sent 2 additional heavy cruisers into the engagement zone. The Verdun hit one of them on the way in. 7th Convergence added this to the file. The file was getting very large. At the edge of the engagement zone, outside scanner range of the fighting, Admiral Cho had not left her command bridge in 12 hours either. Her staff had stopped trying to update her on other sectors of the conflict. She stood at her own tactical screen and watched the Verdun's transponder signal, steady and small and impossible, in the center of the red. Someone on her staff said what everyone had been thinking for the last 6 hours. She should be dead by now. Cho said nothing, but she did not order them to stop monitoring. The Verdun's transponder blinked, once, steady. It had been blinking steady for 12 hours. Outside the ship, the Quorum fleet burned with light. Inside the ship, Solus hummed. Ensign Yara Chin died at hour 14. She was 23. She worked in engineering, and she had a habit of leaving her tools in the exact wrong place for someone else to trip over. And she had never once apologized for this, but had also never let anyone on her shift go hungry when the ration schedules got confused. A power relay on Deck 6 overloaded during a direct hit. She was standing next to it. Voss stood still for 3 seconds. Exactly 3. Then she turned back to the screen. Petty Officer Roshan Mehta died at hour 16. A hull rupture on the port side. Fast. He had been working on the breach from the outside with an emergency repair kit when the second hit came. The kind of death that gave no time for anything. His station went dark on the bridge board, and Voss stood still for 3 seconds and turned back to the screen. Lieutenant Commander Felix Ague died at hour 19. Weapons console. He had kept the ship's main gun firing for longer than anyone had thought the system could run under the strain. It gave out while he was still at it. Voss stood still for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was her whole eulogy. She did not have more to give right now. She would have more later. She was saving it for later. That was what she told herself. The Verdun had been in combat for 20 hours. The ship's hull integrity read 41%. The main sensor array was down to 30%. 2 of the 4 weapon batteries were running on manual control because the automated systems had burned out. The crew was 8 people, where it had been 11. Prell had lost count of the protein bars. He had stopped counting around bar 12. He was doing math on the damage board that should not have been adding up to anything useful, and somehow kept adding up to something they could work with. Because Prell was the kind of person whose brain got very focused in a crisis, and his crisis math was better than his regular math. Solus was still humming, lower now, slower. Okafor was still at his station. He ran weapons with the calm of a person who had found the bottom of their fear early in the fight, and had been standing on it ever since. Solid ground has a different quality when you know there's nothing under it. He had stopped thinking about tomorrow, and had become entirely, specifically, present in the work. He still had not looked at the photo. It was Prell who asked the question. He asked it in the quiet between two exchanges of fire, when the bridge was briefly calm, the way a sea is briefly calm between swells. He looked at Voss, and he did not frame it carefully, or build up to it. He just asked, "Commander, why?" Not "Why are we still here?" Not "What is the plan?" Not "Do you think we're going to make it?" Just the one word, small and honest, that contained all the other questions inside it. Voss did not look at him immediately. She looked at the tactical screen, at the 400 ships that had become 372 over the course of 20 hours, at the gate, at the 3 planets behind it that still had people on them. Then she looked at Prell. Kepler Station didn't have anyone to buy it time, she said. Prell held her gaze for a moment. He nodded, once. He opened another protein bar and went back to the damage board. That was all. No speech, no argument, no further explanation offered, and none requested. Voss turned back to the screen. Solace adjusted their heading, 2 degrees south. Okafor fired. Far from the battle zone, Admiral Cho was receiving visitors. Her command ship had become, over the past 20 hours, the place where people came to watch a signal on a screen. 3 other captains had asked permission to be on the bridge, then 5 more. Then alien liaison officers from the Veth and Arathi delegations, species who had trade agreements with Earth, and had been neutral in the war with the Quorum, had requested access to the tactical feed. Nobody had sent out an announcement. The Verdun's combat telemetry was being broadcast on every Terran and Allied military frequency in the sector, because it was an active combat asset. And it turned out that when a single damaged survey ship held position against 400 enemy vessels for 20 hours, people found out about it. Cho stood at her screen and said very little. She had spent the last several hours doing the thing she was least comfortable doing, which was waiting. She had sent no orders to the Verdun, because there were no orders to send. Voss was not following a plan. There was no plan to attach orders to. She had, in the last hour, received 3 informal requests from other captains, asking if a re-engagement order was being considered. She had not answered them. She had no answer. She was watching the signal on the screen, and she was thinking about something she could not put into proper military language, which was that Mara Voss was doing something that Cho could observe and could not name and could not stop watching. Inside the Quorum fleet, 7th Convergence had a problem. Not the Verdun, or not only the Verdun. The Verdun was a problem it understood tactically, even if it didn't understand it in any other way. The Verdun kept repositioning, kept forcing re-engagement. Every time the fleet moved to advance past it toward the gate, the Verdun put itself in the way again. It could not stop the advance, but it could make the advance cost more than advancing was worth. And over 20 hours the math of that had accumulated. The real problem was the signal. 7th Convergence had become aware in the last several hours that the Verdun's combat telemetry was being received across a very wide range of frequencies, including frequencies used by species that were not allied with Earth, including the Veth, including the Arathi, including 4 other neutral species whose territories bordered the Quorum's expansion routes. These species were watching. They were watching a single damaged Terran ship refuse to move. 7th Convergence could model military outcomes. It could calculate fleet engagements across hundreds of variables. What it could not calculate, what it was discovering it had no model for, was what watching this did to a species that had not yet decided which side of a conflict they were on. The hive mind had a word for the Verdun's behavior now. It had found it in its deep archive of conquered species, used twice before in 4 centuries. The word in the Quorum's language translated into other tongues roughly as the wound that bites back. Both times it had encountered this behavior before, the Quorum had destroyed the species entirely. They were thinking about that. 7th Convergence ran its conquest algorithm. The algorithm had a threshold, a point at which the cost of defeating a target exceeded the strategic value of defeating it, at which point the quorum bypassed and neutralized rather than continued engagement. The Verdun had crossed that threshold 14 hours ago, and yet, every time the fleet moved to bypass it, the Verdun repositioned, forced them back into engagement, made itself impossible to step over. It had no right to still be a factor in these calculations. It was one ship, a small one, running on emergency power and repair foam and the will of 8 people. It remained a factor. At hour 21, the Verdun's reactor began cascade failure warnings. Prell read the board and said nothing for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Reactor is going into cascade." The bridge absorbed this. "How long?" Voss said. 30 minutes, maybe a little more." Solus stopped humming. The quiet that came after was not silence. It was the sound of 8 people understanding something all at the same time. Not panicking, not scrambling for the escape pods, just understanding. Each one of them, separately, working through it, and arriving at the same place. Nobody moved toward the evacuation stations. Voss looked at her crew. Okafor, Solus, Prell, the others at their stations. She looked at all of them, and she knew in the same way she had known things about them for 6 months, by watching rather than asking, that nobody was going anywhere. Okafor reached into his chest pocket. He took out the photograph. He looked at it for a long moment. His daughter, 9 years old, squinting at the camera in a way that meant she was laughing. He looked at the photo. Then he put it back in his pocket, not back on the console. In his pocket, close to him. He returned to his station. Voss turned to the screen. 30 minutes, she thought. 30 minutes was a while. A lot could happen in 30 minutes. She had watched a battle turn in less. "Let's use the time," she said. A Verdun moved. The first Allied ship came back at hour 22. It came without an order. That was the thing Cho could not explain later when people asked. There had been no command issued. The captain of the TES Marshpoint had been watching the Verdun's telemetry feed for 11 hours, and it simply, without a word to his crew that anyone later recorded, turned his ship around. His crew had not objected. 3 minutes later the TES Callaway followed. Then the Oran Bridge. Then 6 more Terran vessels in the space of 8 minutes, like something that had been held back, finally let go. Then the ones Cho had not expected. 2 ships from the Veth delegation. Vessels she had never seen move in anything resembling urgency, because the Veth were old and slow, and had a saying in their language that translated roughly as, "First understand the water, before you decide to swim." They had been watching the Verdun for 21 hours. They had apparently understood the water. Then an Arathi cruiser, then 3 more. Then a fleet signal from the Terran, a species that had not spoken to any Terran military command in 4 years, whose first transmission in 4 years was, "Threshold gate, we are coming." Admiral Cho stood at her tactical screen and watched the fleet assemble, and she did not give a single order, because there was no order to give. People were making decisions she had not asked for, based on something she had not commanded, based on one signal on one screen that had been blinking for 21 hours in a place it had no reason to still be blinking. She finally opened a direct channel to the Verdun. She had meant to say something with rank in it, something shaped like a commander talking to a subordinate. The words she had prepared were professional and precise, and they left her entirely when she heard the sound of the Verdun's bridge, the hum of a woman calculating nav adjustments, the low beep of a damage board being managed, the ordinary sounds of people still working. She said, "Commander Voss, the fleet is re-engaging. You're not alone." A pause. 3 seconds. Then Voss said, "Took you long enough." Cho put a hand over her mouth. It was not grief. It was something that did not have a cleaner name. She took the hand away and went back to her command board. On the Verdun, Prell had 24 minutes on the reactor clock. He did not tell Voss. She knew. He knew she knew. The number sat on the board, and they both read it the same way you read weather, as information about conditions you cannot change, that still tells you how to move. Solus had started humming again, the fast version of the tune now. Calculations, course adjustments. The Allied fleet was re-entering the engagement zone, and the Quorum fleet was being forced to respond to multiple vectors for the first time in the battle. Things were changing. The math was changing. Okafor fired the last charge from Battery 2. It hit a Quorum destroyer, at a range that Okafor's targeting system flagged as low probability, which Okafor had stopped reading as a reason not to try approximately 15 hours ago. The destroyer lost power. Inside 7th Convergence, 400 data streams revised their threat assessments simultaneously. The tactical picture had changed. The Allied fleet's return was a variable the hive mind had not weighted. It had assessed the probability of the Allied fleet returning as negligible, because the Allied fleet had retreated, and retreating fleets did not return once the order was given. This was a known behavior. This was in the model. The model had been built on 4 centuries of other species. 7th Convergence ran new fleet projections. With the returning Allied forces, and the 3 non-Terran fleets now engaging, the engagement had shifted from a straightforward advance to a contested battle that would take 12 to 15 more hours to resolve. The gate would still fall, but the timeline had extended significantly. The cost had increased significantly, and there was a new variable in the equation that 7th Convergence was having serious trouble quantifying. The new variable was the species that had come. The Veth and the Arathi and the Terran were not Terran allies. They had no obligation to this conflict. They had been neutral. They had been watching a single Terran ship refuse to move for 21 hours, and they had come. 7th Convergence ran analysis on why. The analysis produced no clean result. The Quorum understood war. It understood alliance and self-interest and tactical cooperation. It understood that species sometimes came to the aid of others because they calculated benefit for themselves. It had a full model for that. What it did not have a model for was what happens to a species that watches something refuse to stop and decides, not because it is profitable, not because it is safe, but because of something else entirely, that it will stand next to that thing. The algorithm called this behavior contagion, and had no further classification for it. 20 minutes left on the Verdun's reactor clock. Voss felt the ship shudder under a hit that would have been catastrophic 2 days ago, and was just another entry on the damage board now. Hull integrity at 31%. The Verdun was staying in the fight the way an old building stays standing in a storm, not because it is strong, but because it has gotten used to the wind. Reactor cascade in 18 minutes, Prell said. I know. What do you want to do? Voss looked at the tactical screen. The Allied fleet was pressing the Quorum's left flank. The Terran ships were coming in hard on the right. The Quorum advance was no longer advancing. It was, for the first time in this engagement, responding. She thought about 3 planets behind the gate. She thought about a food hall with bad noodles, and children running between tables. She thought about the fact that the Quorum fleet right now could not ignore the Verdun, even if it wanted to. Because the Verdun was in the middle of the engagement zone, and it was still firing, and it was still moving, and it had been the first piece on this board. And everything else had arranged itself around it. 18 minutes was a while. Keep firing, she said. Okafor kept firing. At 14 minutes, the Quorum fleet made its decision. 7th Convergence ran the algorithm one final time. The cost of continuing engagement now exceeded the strategic value of the gate. This was a clear result. Clear enough that even the flag marked unknown type, the flag it had placed on the Verdun hours ago, could not change the math. The Quorum fleet began to withdraw. It was clean and organized. The way everything the Quorum did was clean and organized. They did not panic. They did not scatter. They pulled back in formation, leaving the gate zone in good order, covering their own retreat with practiced efficiency. The last Quorum vessel cleared the engagement zone at hour 23. On the Verdun's bridge, the tactical screen went from red to orange to a color that was not quite green, but was moving in that direction. Prell stared at the board. He counted the remaining enemy signatures. He counted again. They're gone, he said. He sounded like he was telling himself something he did not entirely believe. They left. Solus had stopped humming. She was looking at the gate. At the channel, clear now, leading to 3 planets that were still there. Okafor did not say anything. He reached into his chest pocket. He took out the photograph. He held it in his hand, and looked at it for a long time. His daughter squinting at the camera, laughing at something outside the frame that he could not see, and had never been able to see, but which had kept him company for 23 hours anyway. He did not put it back on the console. He kept it in his hand. The reactor alarm sounded. 8 minutes. Voss reached over and silenced it. The Allied fleet was moving through the gate zone now, ships surrounding the Verdun, scanning for hull integrity, transmitting emergency repair teams, filling the tactical screen with the blue of friendly signals. The Verdun drifted. Quiet now. Power at 4%. Hull at 27. Barely a ship. Still there. Cho's voice came over the channel, stripped of rank and procedure. Just a woman's voice, a little unsteady. "Threshold gate is secure," she said. "Commander Voss, I want you to know, 3 alien fleets came because of you. Because of what you did here. I don't fully have the words for it yet." Voss did not answer for a moment. Then, holding the door, she said, "That's all it was." She closed her eyes. She was still in the chair. She had been in the chair for 23 hours, and she would stay in it until the ship was safe, and her crew was safe, and there was nothing else that needed doing. Her hands were shaking. Both of them. She noticed this distantly, the way you notice something small that has been happening for a long time, and you just got around to seeing it. She let them shake. Outside the ship, the Allied fleet held the gate. The board met 6 weeks later, in a clean room on a clean ship, that smelled like recycled air and coffee, and the particular quiet of a place where important people had gathered to understand something that had already happened. Commander Mara Voss sat at one end of a long table. At the other end sat 3 admirals, 2 civilian oversight officials, a Veth diplomatic observer, and a woman from the Terran Military Historical Office, who had the expression of someone who had spent her career studying the past, and was now sitting across from a piece of it. They were not hostile. That was the thing that surprised Voss most. She had expected hostile. She had disobeyed a direct retreat order. In any clean reading of military law, the hearings should have had a different energy. But the war had shifted in the 6 weeks since Threshold Gate. The 3 species who had joined based on what they saw, Veth, Arathi, Terran, had brought fleet resources that changed the math of the entire conflict. 3 other neutral species had sent formal inquiries about alliance terms. The Quorum Advance had not made a significant offensive move since the battle. The board was not hostile. It was, Voss realized, trying to understand something well enough to use it. The senior admiral leaned forward. "Commander, in your own words, why did you disobey the retreat order at Threshold Gate?" Voss had known this question was coming. She had tried at various points in the 6 weeks since to put together an answer that sounded like doctrine, something that could be written into a manual, something teachable. She had not found one. "I don't know that it translates," she said. The admiral waited. "Kepler Station," she said. "I was there. I left when I was told to leave. The station died. The retreat saved nothing I could find afterward. When the order came at Threshold Gate, I thought about that. I thought about the planets behind the gate. I thought that if someone was going to buy those planets time, it was going to have to be me, because I was the one who stayed. You knew the likely outcome for your ship." "Yes. And you proceeded." "I did." The room was quiet for a moment. "Commander," one of the civilian officials said carefully, "there are 3 new species in alliance with Earth because of what you did at Threshold Gate. There are analysts who believe your stand delayed the quorum enough to prevent the fall of the Castor system. By any strategic assessment, the outcome was significant. But we need to understand the decision in order to turn it into a procedure," Voss said, not unkindly. "So it can be taught." The official paused. "Yes." Voss looked at the table. She looked at her hands, which were steady now. had been steady for 6 weeks. The shaking had stopped the day after the battle, somewhere between the medical check and the repair crew boarding the Verdun, and had not come back. "I can't give you a procedure," she said. "I stayed because I decided to stay. That's the whole thing. I understand that's not enough for a manual." The Veth observer had not spoken during the entire session. It was old, its species aged slowly, and it sat with the stillness of something that had watched a great deal of history from a long distance. Now it spoke, in the careful translated tones of its communication device. "Among my people," it said, "there is a concept. It means the point at which a calculation ends and a decision begins. We had forgotten that these are different things. The Verdun reminded us." The room absorbed this. Voss looked at the Veth observer. The Veth observer looked at Voss. No further words were exchanged. None were needed. Far away from that clean room, in a system that Seventh Convergence had retreated to after Threshold Gate, the Quorum Advance was doing its own accounting. Classified. Added to the deep archive of 4 centuries of expansion. It sat in the files alongside 2 other entries, both very old, both flagged with the same designation, the wound that bites back. The tactical file had been updated. The new note, in the precise language of the hive mind, stated that Terran military forces should be considered to contain a variable that current modeling could not reliably predict. The variable was not strength, it was not technology, it was not numbers. The variable was designated in the file as willingness to accept terminal cost without calculable return. The note that followed said, simply, "Do not engage Terran core systems without resolution of this variable." They did not engage Terran core systems for 11 years. 11 years changed a great deal. Ensign Dak Prell, 6 months after Threshold Gate, was back on a survey vessel, a different ship, smaller and quieter, running equipment between stations in a part of the sector that had stayed clear of the front. He was sitting in a crew lounge, telling the story of Threshold Gate to 3 people who had asked. And he was getting several details wrong, in ways that made the story larger, and nobody was correcting him, because the truth was already large enough that a few extra details did not change what it was. A young crew member across the table asked if he had been scared. Prell thought about this. He thought about the protein bars. He thought about the damage board, and the reactor clock, and the sound of Solus humming, and the moment when Voss had said, "No thank you," to 400 ships like she was declining a second cup of coffee. "I was eating when I should have been scared," he said. "I think the fear just never got around to making an appointment." He opened a protein bar. The crew members stared at him. Prell stared back pleasantly. Lieutenant Okafor went home. He had not been home in 14 months. His daughter was 9. She met him at the door of their housing unit and looked at him the way children look at someone they have been waiting for. All at once, the whole thing, nothing held back. He sat with her that evening, and she asked about the war, in the way children ask about things that are very large. Not looking for the large version, looking for a piece she could hold. She asked about his ship. He told her about the Verdun. She asked what it was like. He thought about the bridge, about Voss in the command chair for 23 hours, about Solis humming, about Prell and his protein bars, about the moment the Quorum fleet started withdrawing and the tactical screen began to change color. It was like being in a building in a very bad storm, he said, and the building stayed. She considered this. Because it was strong? Because the people inside decided it would. She nodded. This seemed reasonable to her. He reached into his pocket. He took out the photograph, the one from his console, the one he had moved to his pocket before the last 30 minutes of the battle, the one he had kept there and carried home. He showed it to her. She looked at the photo of herself, squinting at the camera. "Why do the edges look like that?" "Because it was important cargo," he said. "What's cargo?" "Something you carry because it matters where it ends up." She thought about this for a long time, with the seriousness that 9-year-olds apply to things that feel important. Then she took the photograph and looked at it. Then she gave it back. Then she went to find something to eat, because she was hungry, and the conversation had apparently reached a satisfying conclusion. Okafor sat with the photograph, and was quiet for a while. The last time Voss walked through the Verdun, the ship was in dry dock. The engineers had made their assessment. The hull damage was too extensive, the systems too degraded, the cost of full repair exceeding the cost of building new. The Verdun was being considered for preservation. A museum, perhaps, or a permanent memorial at Threshold Gate. Nothing had been decided. She walked the main corridor alone. No crew. The ship was empty and powered down, and very quiet in the way that spaces are quiet, when they have been full of sound, and then abruptly emptied of it. The corridor lights were on emergency power. Dim. The walls had patch foam in 3 places she could see from where she walked. The deck plating had warped near the midsection from heat damage. It caught her foot slightly as she passed, and she thought, of course it does. She walked the whole length of the ship, from the bridge to engineering, to the crew quarters, to the cargo bay, and back. She did not speak. She did not need to. She was not there to say goodbye. She was not sure she believed in goodbyes, practically speaking. She was there because this ship deserved someone to walk its corridor one more time, while it was still a place you could walk. 3 alien ambassadors had told her she changed history. 2 human generals. A journalist who had called her the woman who held the door. She had read the phrase and thought it was a reasonable description. She had not argued with it. She reached the end of the main corridor and stopped. She put her hand on the wall. It was warm. Emergency power running through the conduits behind it. The last heat of a ship that had not finished cooling down yet. She kept her hand there for a moment. She had been told by people whose job it was to tell her these things, that the Quorum advance would not push toward the core systems for years. That the alliances formed after Threshold Gate had changed the shape of the war. That 3 planets behind a gate were still there because she had made a decision in a chair on a bad day. She did not feel like history. She felt like a person who was tired and had a ship to say goodbye to. She took her hand off